Next up, let's add in the RollDice component, the smarter parent component that will manage state and pass in the individual faces. It will have a button and have some logic in there, so let's get started. I'm going to make a new file called RollDice.js. And then, of course, import React and component from React. I'm going to define my class, RollDice, which extends component. And then we need a render, and we also are going to need a constructor because we're working with state here. So constructor, and same thing, super props, standard, and then in here, let's set our initial state to be something. What do we want to manage? Well, we need to keep track of two faces, two die, and the numbers that we want to show. And let's have an initial value of 1, and then die 2 will also have an initial value of 1. And remember, I'm using the words rather than the numbers because that makes it much easier. I can just pass this value in to my die as a prop and then replace this with 1 or 2 instead of this, which will break everything. So I won't be using numbers at all. Well, I will be at one point to pick things, but for now, 1 and 1 for die 1 and die 2. Okay, so that's the initial state. In the render, I'm going to add a simple div. So return our div. And then I'm going to start by importing that die component. So import die from /die. And then let's render two die in here. So the first die, we're going to pass in face. And let's do this .state .face .die1. And then I'll duplicate this and do this .state .die2. So we will be rendering two die dynamically with different values, but for now, we're not changing the state. So we should just have snake eyes, 1 and 1. And then I need to make sure I export default RollDice. And then in my app, I'm no longer going to render the die. Instead, I'm going to import RollDice from /RollDice. And then in here, we just want one RollDice component, which should give us 2 dice. And does it? All right, looks like we have a problem. It can't find RollDice. Let's see. I can see the problem here. I called it RollDice. As you can see the name of the file. You can also see in the component, it's RollDice. It makes sense. Silly issue. Now, if we refresh, we're getting snake eyes. I'm zoomed in quite a bit. Okay, there we go. That's how it should be working. Now what we need to do is add in the logic to dynamically change things. So I'm going to start by defining a simple array that contains all of the sides, and I'm going to use default props for that. So you could put this as part of state potentially, but this is never going to change. It's just going to be a list of 1, 2, these are all the different options. So it doesn't really make sense to put this in the state. It's not going to change. It doesn't have to be a prop either. You could just make this a variable on its own. It doesn't have to be state or props. You can just work with regular data. But what I'm going to do is use default props because then somebody could potentially pass in, instead of app.js, they could pass in sides is only limited to 1 and 2 if there was a two-sided die, like a coin flip or something. So we could do that, although I would need to use curly braces, which I didn't just use. But I'm not going to. For now, just rely on the defaults, which are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, so now we have those choices. Next, what we need to do is add in our button. This button, when we click on it, needs to call a function, which will roll the dice for us, basically pick new values, which will then set the state, which will cause these to re-render. Remember how this pattern works. We manage the state up here. Anytime you call set state and a value changes, then you're going to re-render the component. And in our case, we have all of this to re-render, which means that these 2 dice are also going to be re-rendered and they will have new values passed in. Okay, so this button, let's just add some text that says roll dice. And then let's add an on click. Now this won't exist yet, but let's add a method called this.roll. So now we need to define this.roll. So I'll come up here and define roll. And what we need to do is choose 2 new numbers. So pick 2 new rolls and then set state with new rolls, which will cause the whole thing to re-render. Okay, so to pick 2 new numbers, we have this array of sides. So I just need to pick one thing out of here. So we've seen how to do this a couple of times. We're going to do a math.random and multiply it by the length of this list or this array. So that's this.props to access this, .sides.length. The problem, as we've seen many times, is that this is not an integer. So we're going to floor it. So math.floor that whole thing is going to give us a number from 0 up to the end of the last index, which is what? That's going to be 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, I can count. So from 0 to 5. And then we will use that number to access the data out of there. So it would look like this. This dot props dot sides at that index. This is kind of a long line, but it works. And I'm going to make this a variable called const new die1 and save and format it a bit nicer. So you can see we're picking a number, so we can imagine this is going to be 0. And then we're just setting new die1 to be whatever value is at 0, which is 1. Now if we happen to pick 4 as a random number, then we would be picking this number right here, 5, or that word. Okay, so I'm going to duplicate this and do the same thing, but this time new die2. A new random number. We don't want to use the same number, otherwise we'd have two dice showing the same face. Now we need to update the state. So it's as simple as this.setState, and we pass in an object. So die1 is now going to equal new die1, and die2 is now going to equal new die2. Whoops, I just did die1. There we go. And this should be everything we need, except if you're paying attention, we're missing one thing to make it all work. When we click the button, roll is called, but as soon as it gets to this line, it doesn't know what this is referring to. Cannot read property props of undefined. So we need to tell it ahead of time, this is what we mean when we say this. So what do we mean? We want the component itself to be the value of this, the instance of the component. So we'll do a this.roll equals this.roll.bind this. Take the current value of this, which is this entire component instance, and bind it so that you know what we're talking about. These references to this are going to refer to this individual component. All right, now if we test this out, it should work. There we go. So we are getting random numbers. Let's just make sure we're getting a 6, perfect, and a 1. All right, so we're getting the correct range. There's no animation, there's no styling, but we at least have things working. We are re-rendering everything, and if we open up the React Dev Tools, you'll see that as the state changes here, if we take a look at the RollDice component, when I click this, you can see those boxes appear. So the whole component re-renders for RollDice, but also those boxes signify that the individual die, both dice, are re-rendering as well, because they are part of this render method. So when we call this.setState, remember, this whole component re-renders. And what happens inside that component, inside the render, we have two other components. And each one of those components is going to re-render and have a new value passed in as its prop called face. And you can see that just one more time. Watch the boxes around it. Everything re-renders. All right. So this pattern is really, really common where we have a stateful parent passing down parts of its state as props. We'll get a lot more practice with it, but I just want to make that very clear. This comes up a lot. The die component itself isn't managing any state. It's all taken care of from the parent, and then we pass down the bare minimum bit of information as a prop so that this die component can display correctly. Okay. Moving on, in the next video, we'll work on styling things quickly, and then after that, we'll talk about making the animation work, talk about disabling the button, changing the text. There's a lot we have left to do.